Hello, my name is Farrell Howe, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager at Kalamazoo Public Library, and this is my 9/11 story. On that day, I was getting my morning started, and I then heard my boss scream from the room next door. Those of us that were working that day rushed into our office and just witnessed the absolute devastation that was occurring live on the news, on the television in her office, and we just watched in just dumbstruck horror, not believing what we were seeing as the first tower had already been hit when the news coverage started, and there was still just speculation if it was an aviation accident or what it was, but it became very clear when we watched live. The second plane hit the second World Trade Tower. That it was a terrorist attack, and I remember all of us kind of just standing there in utter disbelief. We just kept saying, "This can't be real. This isn't happening." It just seemed like we were watching a movie. It just seemed so unbelievable that something like this would occur, on American soil. And the news just kept getting worse. I mean, it was in the Pentagon, and then it was, the plane being, crashing in Pennsylvania, and just the uncertainty of not knowing what was going on. Amidst all of this, one of my coworkers at the time was on one of the commuter flights out of Newark to San Francisco, and our concern was she was on Flight 93. And I spent a good chunk of that morning trying to get through the airlines and trying to talk to her family to get information for them, because of course they were, just frantic and concerned, as were we as her coworkers, and we just wanted to get information. Unfortunately, because of everything that was going on, the phone lines were tied up. Sometimes you couldn't even just get a connection because there was just so many people on their cell phones at the same time that service was just disrupted. It was overloaded, and just calls we couldn't get completed, or they would get cut off, or everything would just be a busy signal. So it was extremely stressful. Fortunately, we did find out that my coworker was not on that flight. She was actually on one of the previous flights to that one. And she relayed the story later on that she was actually sitting with a couple of young girls who had never seen New York before, and as they were flying over, she pointed out the Twin Towers to them. And just sad that knowing, not too long after that, they were gone. It was extremely heartbreaking. At the time, I was working in what was then the CNA building. This is the big red building in downtown Chicago skyline. If you've never been to Chicago, or if you do go to Chicago, that is the one bright and only bright red building in the Chicago skyline. And I learned that quite a few employees from CNA were actually attending a meeting in World Trade Tower 2 on that day. And they were on the 105th floor. And I believe only a few made it out alive from that. And as I was out in the halls, I could hear, other people screaming and crying as they realized that, their friends, their coworkers were gone. And they watched them die right in front of their face. And it was just devastating to hear. I didn't work directly for CNA at that time. I worked for a nonprofit that was renting space in the building. But it was, just horrific to be in the building and walk around and realize that, employees that were, just there for a meeting, they were just there for a meeting, and they weren't going to be coming back. It was extremely devastating. The decision was made at some point to evacuate Chicago. There was downtown Chicago. There was concern that there was other flights that were unaccounted for. There was rumors that there was one heading to Chicago, so people were panicking. They decided to shut down downtown Chicago and evacuate. And I just remember, leaving the building and walking outside and seeing people looking up at the sky and just crying and being scared. And all the public transportation was shut down. There were no buses or trains, so I had to walk home, which took about 2 hours because I didn't live anywhere near downtown Chicago. And during that whole walk, I spent it still trying to get through the airlines and trying to talk to my coworker's family, because it wasn't until later that day that I learned that she was okay. In terms of things that changed, the CNA building, of course, there was a memorial for the coworkers that were lost, which was very sad. We were all given pins that had the American flag and a yellow ribbon, which I still have to this day, and I still wear every September 11th. And security measures were definitely significantly increased. So we had more security guards. They were doing bag checks. They were doing. We had metal detectors put in. It was definitely a lot more strict. We had ID badges that were made that had to be scanned to get in and out of the building, so they can account for everybody. It definitely was a lot more stringent than it had been before. And of course, everybody knows that flying and everything after that became extremely challenging. Beforehand you could walk on with a bottle of water. There was, really no TSA. You weren't getting X-rayed. You weren't getting your hands, swabbed for bomb residue, and all of that changed after 9/11. So some people can't even imagine, that they weren't around prior to 9/11, what it was like to actually travel beforehand. It was a lot easier. I distinctly remember there being a lot more people of Middle Eastern descent were targeted, much like we've seen today with COVID. People of Asian descent being targeted, just being blamed. A lot of people of Middle Eastern descent were also being blamed and profiled. A lot of incidents of people being attacked, threatened, etc. I remember actually distinctly being on a bus going to work and seeing a man of Middle Eastern descent who was on the bus, and it appeared he was praying. He was speaking out loud. It appeared he was praying. And several people got off the bus because they were scared. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were afraid of him. And I remember just feeling terrible for this man, because in reality, it was probably he who was scared, being the only person of Middle Eastern descent on that plane, dressed with the turban and with all the prejudice that was happening at that time. He was probably afraid, and but everybody, the people that got off just were terrified of him and got off the bus. So it was just definitely something that I never really noticed before 9/11, but definitely noticed a lot of that happening afterwards. About 6 weeks after 9/11, friends of mine and myself went to New York. We had a trip booked prior to 9/11. We decided to keep it, and we went. And we had the cab driver take us to Ground Zero. And I can't even describe the devastation, what it was like to see that in person. The smell of jet fuel and just thick dust. Was so potent. I mean, we were blocks away from the actual site itself, and you could smell it. It just hit you. And I remember getting a headache from it. I remember my head hurt from it instantly. We got there, and all the fences, everything was fenced off, of course, and the fences were covered with photos and mementos and pictures and letters to people that were missing. And my friends and I, read the letters, and I just remember we were just sobbing. The emotion was so high and so strong, and such sorrow and misery. We were just heartbroken for the people of New York, and I just remember just feeling so terrible for the people of New York who had witnessed this in person and lost family members and lost coworkers. To see it in person was just so, it was bad enough to watch it on TV, but to see it in person was just completely overwhelming. Some of the buildings that had been damaged around the Twin Towers still were in the process of still being, demolished and taken down. And so the skyline, it looked like something out of a movie. It looked like a movie set. It did not look real. Just the utter devastation, all the buildings around it, shops, windows blown out, covered in dust. It was really devastating to see it, and I remember just feeling so terrible for the people of New York and the people that witnessed this firsthand. It really was just horrific. Afterwards, one of the things that I ended up doing when I worked at the CNA building at the time was I volunteered to be part of the evacuation team. We learned a lot with our own evacuation of that building, that we had a lot of weaknesses. And especially with trying to get people who could not walk out of the building on their own accord out of the building. They couldn't leave, and if they had shut down if the elevators weren't able to work, these people would not be able to get out of the building. So I actually volunteered to be part of the evacuation team, and I was trained to utilize it was basically like a gurney that you could be strapped into, and it would climb stairs. You'd hold it and kind of guide it down the stairs, and at the time I was in my early 20s and didn't have any family that was depending on me, so I wanted to help. After 9/11, everybody just had the sense of you wanted to do something, and there was really nothing we could do, but I felt like this could be some, my contribution to be able to help and be one of the last people out of the building and help those that did have, people that were relying on them. Recently, I'd say within the last couple of years, I was able to go back to New York and visit the 9/11 Museum. And if you have not been and are curious about what happened on 9/11, I highly recommend going to the Memorial Museum. It was indescribable. It really captured what it felt like, what had happened. Through visuals and phone calls and people's final phone calls and the debris that was collected and saved, parts of the towers that were collected and saved, people's personal effects that were collected and saved and put on display, videos, and it's completely overwhelming. I can understand somebody who lived in New York during the time and witnessed this in person, probably having no desire to go into the museum, because I'm sure how triggering that must be if you witness that in person. But even just somebody who watched it, on TV, it was triggering. It was very upsetting to read, hear these stories and realize the magnitude of how many people died just in New York alone on that day. And I do highly recommend, if you have an opportunity to go to the museum, to please do so. It really is a wonderful experience in terms of understanding just how devastating and how important we learn the lessons of 9/11 is. I hope that nothing like this ever happens again in my lifetime. I know it was definitely a defining moment in my life, and I hope to not have another one of these in my lifetime, but it was definitely an eye-opening experience. It was a game changer. We were not safe in the United States. We were not immune to the terrorist attacks that we saw in other countries. And it was definitely a time that the whole country came together to support one another and to help one another. And just really, especially support those that were directly impacted by, 9/11 New York and the Pentagon and Pennsylvania. So there was some heartwarming moments too to see, the country come together, but it definitely was indescribable experiencing that. But I do recommend, if you're curious, would like to learn more about 9/11, and if you have the opportunity to go to New York, please visit the memorial and the museum, and that'll definitely bring that home to you more than my little story. But thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me, and have a good one.